First story. There's something oddly comforting about starting your day at a local coffee shop. The smell of freshly ground beans, the quiet hum of morning conversation, it feels like a little bubble of calm before the day truly begins. That's why I'm there every morning at 7:30 sharp, without fail. I sit in the corner, sipping my latte, watching the same people come and go, caught in their routines just like I am. But one morning, that routine was broken in a way I'll never forget. It was a Tuesday, nothing special. I'd gotten to the cafe, ordered my usual, and settled in with my book. The place was a bit more crowded than usual, students hunched over laptops, a couple of business people holding early meetings. I was in my zone, the soft murmur of conversations blending into background noise. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting at a table by the window, a man in his late 30s, probably. He was dressed casually, but not sloppily, jeans, a button-down shirt, and a worn leather jacket draped over the back of his chair. He had a laptop in front of him, but unlike the others, he wasn't typing or scrolling. He was just staring at the screen, completely still, his coffee untouched beside him. I don't know what drew my attention to him, but something about the way he sat there felt off. Like he was waiting for something, or maybe dreading it. I didn't think much of it at first. People have bad days, right? Maybe he was stressed about work or just having a moment of reflection. But as the minutes ticked by, he didn't move. He barely blinked. It was like he was frozen in time, while everyone else in the cafe continued on with their lives, oblivious. Then, his phone rang. The sound startled me out of my observations, and it clearly jolted him as well. He scrambled to pick up the phone, almost knocking over his coffee in the process. The cafe was still busy, so I couldn't hear what was said, but I could see the change in his expression. Whatever was happening on the other end of that call, it wasn't good. His face went pale, his hand clenched around the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I tried not to stare, but it was hard to look away. He started talking, his voice low and tense, the kind of tone that suggests things are about to unravel. His eyes darted around the cafe, as if he was trying to find an escape route. Then, he abruptly stood up, shoved his laptop into his bag, and bolted for the door, his coffee left untouched and forgotten on the table. I don't know why I followed him. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the look on his face, but something made me get up and walk out the door after him. He was already halfway down the street, walking quickly, his phone still pressed to his ear. I trailed behind him, keeping my distance, feeling a bit like a stalker but unable to stop myself. After a few blocks, he ducked into a small alleyway, and I hesitated. This was getting weird. But something told me that he wasn't just going for a walk to clear his head. This was something bigger. So, against my better judgment, I kept going. When I turned into the alley, I saw him sitting on a low wall, his head in his hands, the phone on the ground beside him. He looked like his world had just fallen apart. I stood there, awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Should I approach him? Should I just leave and pretend I hadn't seen any of this? Before I could make up my mind, he lifted his head and saw me. There was a moment of silence, where we just stared at each other, and I felt my heart race. I was sure he was going to be angry, or tell me to mind my own business. But instead, he just sighed and motioned for me to sit down. I don't even know why I'm telling you this, he said after a long pause. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been holding back tears. But everything's gone. My business, my savings, everything. I just got the call. Someone hacked my accounts. Wiped them clean. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to a complete stranger whose life has just been turned upside down? He ran his hands through his hair, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know what to do. Years of work, just gone. It was surreal. Here I was, a random guy who just happened to be at the same coffee shop, sitting in an alley with a man whose entire life had just crumbled in a matter of minutes. I didn't know him. I didn't know his story. But in that moment, I felt like I needed to say something, anything, to make it better. I'm sorry, I finally said. That sounds awful. Is there anything I can do?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Unless you can magically make a few $100,000 reappear, no." We sat in silence for a while after that. I didn't know what else to say, and he didn't seem in the mood to talk anymore. Eventually, he stood up, dusted off his jeans, and picked up his phone. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For listening, I guess." And with that, he walked away, disappearing into the busy street. I sat there for a few more minutes, trying to process what had just happened. In the grand scheme of things, I was just a witness to a small, tragic moment in someone else's life. But it stuck with me, the fragility of it all. How quickly things can fall apart without warning. The next day, I went back to the coffee shop, but he wasn't there. In fact, I never saw him again. I sometimes wonder what happened to him, if he managed to rebuild his life, or if that moment in the alley was the beginning of the end. It's strange how life works like that. You can be living your routine, going through the motions, and then, out of nowhere, you cross paths with someone whose life is in free fall. And for a brief moment, your worlds collide, leaving you with a story that you'll carry with you long after they're gone. Second story. I used to think that nothing exciting ever happened in my small town. The same people, the same shops, the same routines. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and you could predict what your day would look like before it even started. I liked the familiarity, to be honest. Life was quiet, and I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of something straight out of a movie. But that's exactly what happened last summer. It started as a regular Thursday. I had the day off, and my plan was simple: grab a sandwich from the local deli, run a few errands, and maybe meet up with my friend Jake for a beer in the evening. Nothing too complicated. I parked my car a block away from the deli and walked the rest of the way. The sun was out, the streets were quiet, it felt like any other summer afternoon. As I walked past the bank on the corner, I noticed something odd. The door, which was usually open during business hours, was closed, and there was a guy standing outside, pacing nervously. He was tall, wearing a hoodie despite the warm weather, and kept glancing at his watch. I remember thinking it was strange, but I brushed it off. People can be weird sometimes, right? I continued down the street to the deli, ordered my usual roast beef sandwich, and sat down to eat. The deli had a big glass window that looked out onto the main road, so I could see everything happening outside. As I sat there, munching on my sandwich, I saw the guy from earlier walk back toward the bank. This time, he didn't stop at the door. He glanced around, and then, with a quick look over his shoulder, he slipped inside. That's when I realized something was definitely off. I'm not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions, but the way he moved, it felt sneaky, like he was trying not to be noticed. My gut told me something wasn't right. I watched the bank for a few minutes, expecting him to come out, but he didn't. The street was still quiet, and no one else seemed to have noticed anything unusual. I tried to go back to my sandwich, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to walk by the bank on my way back to my car, just to see if everything was okay. As I approached the bank, I heard it. A muffled shout. Then another. I stopped in my tracks, my heart suddenly racing. The door was still closed, and now it made sense why. It wasn't closed because the bank was on a break or anything, it was locked. From the inside. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide what to do. Should I call the police? What if it's nothing? What if I'm overreacting? But then I heard it again. Louder this time. A woman's voice, panicked. That was enough for me. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. I could barely keep my voice steady as I told the operator what I thought was happening. The whole time, I kept glancing at the bank, half expecting someone to burst through the door. But everything stayed eerily still. The operator told me to stay put, that the police were on their way. I backed away from the bank and stood by a tree a few yards down, trying to act like I wasn't freaking out. A couple of minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. I kept imagining the worst: hostages, guns, people getting hurt. I'd never been in a situation like this before, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. Finally, I heard sirens. 2 police cars came speeding down the street and skidded to a stop in front of the bank. Officers jumped out, their guns drawn, shouting orders as they moved toward the entrance. I stayed where I was, watching from a safe distance, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, nothing happened. The officers stood outside the bank, their weapons pointed at the door, yelling for whoever was inside to come out. Then, after what felt like forever, the door opened. The guy from earlier, the one in the hoodie, stepped out, his hands in the air. He looked terrified, his face pale as a sheet. Behind him, a couple of bank employees slowly walked out, followed by a woman who was visibly shaken but unharmed. It was over. The police quickly moved in, handcuffing the guy and leading him to one of the squad cars. The bank employees huddled together, talking to the officers, and the woman, who I later found out was the bank manager, started crying. It was surreal, like I was watching it all unfold from outside my own body. One of the officers noticed me standing there and came over to ask if I'd seen anything. I told him what I'd witnessed: the guy pacing outside, going into the bank, the muffled shouts. He nodded, thanked me, and took my statement. Apparently, the guy had tried to rob the bank but had gotten cold feet halfway through. He didn't have a weapon, just a note demanding money, but when the manager hesitated, he panicked and locked the doors, not knowing what to do next. I stayed there for a while, watching as the scene calmed down. More police arrived, and the area was roped off. A crowd had started to gather, curious onlookers trying to piece together what had happened. I felt a weird mix of emotions: relief that no one was hurt, but also shock that something like this had happened in my quiet little town. Eventually, I made my way back to my car, my sandwich still unfinished in the deli. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd been to the whole thing. If I hadn't gone to the deli when I did, if I hadn't noticed the guy acting strange, I wouldn't have been there to call the police. Who knows how it could have ended? When I got home, I sat on my couch, replaying everything in my head. It felt like a dream, like something that couldn't possibly have happened in real life. But it did. The next day, the local news covered the story, and I saw the guy's face on TV. He wasn't much older than me, just a regular guy who had made a terrible decision. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to that point. Desperation? Debt? I'll probably never know. But that day changed the way I see the world a little. You never think something like that will happen to you, until it does. And now, every time I walk past that bank, I can't help but remember how a normal Thursday afternoon turned into one of the craziest days of my life. Third story. This happened about 5 years ago, and to this day, I'm still not sure how I managed to pull it off. It was one of those situations where everything goes so wrong, it ends up turning into a hilarious, unforgettable story. And it all started because I'm terrible with directions. I was in a new city for a work conference. It was one of those events where you don't really know anyone, and the thought of awkward small talk with strangers didn't exactly thrill me. After sitting through a full day of seminars and networking sessions, I was more than ready for a break. That evening, there was supposed to be a cocktail party at a nearby venue, and my plan was to make a brief appearance and then duck out early. I figured I'd get just enough face time to not look like a total hermit, grab a drink, and slip away quietly. So I left the hotel and started walking to the address of the party. It was a short walk, about 15 minutes or so. I had the address plugged into my phone's map, but for some reason, the GPS kept jumping around, and the streets in this part of town were confusing. I must have taken a wrong turn because I ended up completely lost. I was too embarrassed to ask anyone for directions, so I kept walking, hoping I'd stumble across the venue. Eventually, I found a large, fancy building with a lot of people walking in. Everyone was dressed up, and it looked like the kind of place that would host a cocktail party. In my defense, it was dark, and there weren't any obvious signs indicating what the event was, so I just assumed this was the right spot. I walked in, handed my coat to the attendant, and looked around. The place was packed, people everywhere, chatting, drinking, having a good time. The whole setup seemed way more elegant than what I expected for a work event, but I figured maybe the organizers had gone all out. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and started making my way through the crowd, trying to spot anyone from the conference. As I wandered through the room, I noticed something strange. I didn't recognize a single person. No one looked even remotely familiar. And the more I observed, the more I realized that something was definitely off. There were tables with elaborate floral centerpieces, a live band playing soft jazz in the corner, and people were dressed to the nines in tuxedos and gowns. I glanced down at my own outfit, business casual at best, and realized I was severely underdressed for whatever this was. It hit me all at once, I wasn't at the cocktail party. I had somehow crashed a wedding. My heart started racing. I had no idea whose wedding this was or how I'd ended up there, but I was smack in the middle of it, standing next to a massive wedding cake, holding a glass of champagne like I belonged there. I panicked, thinking I'd be kicked out if anyone realized I wasn't supposed to be there. But as I looked around, I noticed that no one was paying attention to me. Everyone was too wrapped up in their own conversations to notice the random guy wandering around. That's when I made a decision I'd play it cool, blend in, and get out as soon as I found the exit. I started moving toward the back of the room, but before I could make my escape, a woman tapped me on the shoulder. I nearly jumped out of my skin, convinced she was about to ask who I was and why I was at her wedding. Instead, she smiled warmly and said, "Aren't you one of Ryan's friends?" Without missing a beat, I nodded. Yeah, from college." She grinned, clearly relieved to have someone to chat with. "I thought so. I went to school with him too. It's such a beautiful wedding, right?" I nodded again, hoping my face didn't betray the sheer terror I was feeling. I didn't know who Ryan was, but at that moment, I was his college buddy. We talked for a few minutes about old times, with me doing my best to be vague and non-committal. She seemed happy to have someone to reminisce with, and I just kept nodding along, praying she wouldn't ask any specific questions. After what felt like an eternity, she was called away by someone else, and I took the opportunity to slip away. I found a side door that led out to the patio, where a few other guests were mingling. From there, I spotted an exit that led to the parking lot, and I made a beeline for it. As I stepped outside, I felt a huge wave of relief. I had made it out without being caught. But just as I thought I was in the clear, I heard someone call out, "Hey! Wait up!" I froze, thinking this was it, someone had figured out I didn't belong, and I was about to be thrown out in disgrace. But when I turned around, it was a guy about my age, dressed in a suit, jogging up to me. "You leaving already?" he asked, a bit out of breath. "The party's just getting started." I forced a smile and shrugged. "Yeah, I've got an early morning tomorrow. Gotta head out." He looked disappointed, but didn't push it. I get it. "Well, it was great seeing you, man. Ryan and I were just talking about how we need to get the old crew together again." I chuckled nervously, gave him a quick wave, and walked away as fast as I could without actually running. I finally made it back to my hotel, my heart still pounding from the close calls. I collapsed onto the bed, laughing at the absurdity of the whole situation. I couldn't believe I'd accidentally crashed a wedding, and not just crashed it, but actually talked to the guests like I was supposed to be there. The next day, I found the actual cocktail party venue. It was a far cry from the fancy wedding I'd wandered into, just a small room with a few conference attendees sipping cheap wine. I stayed for about 20 minutes before heading out, but honestly, the whole thing paled in comparison to the wild adventure I'd had the night before. To this day, I have no idea whose wedding I crashed or how I managed to blend in without anyone calling me out. I guess sometimes, if you act like you belong, people will just assume you do. But it's a lesson I'll never forget, always double-check the address before walking into a party. And who knows? Maybe one day I'll run into Ryan and his college friends again. But this time, I'll make sure I'm actually invited.